Most people experience themselves as continuous. You wake up each morning, assuming the person moving through today is fundamentally the same person who existed yesterday. The body changes gradually, emotions fluctuate, beliefs evolve, memories shift, but beneath all of it there appears to be a stable internal you-carrying identity consistently through time. This feeling is so automatic that it rarely gets questioned directly. Yet psychologically the sense of continuity is largely constructed. The brain continuously rebuilds identity moment by moment, using memory, emotion, attention, prediction, bodily state, social context, and narrative coherence operating beneath awareness. The self does not exist as a fixed object permanently preserved somewhere inside the mind. It emerges dynamically from systems constantly updating according to present conditions. What feels like continuity often comes from the nervous system successfully maintaining enough coherence between changing states that consciousness experiences them as belonging to one stable identity. But the underlying psychological structure is continuously shifting. Different environments activate different emotional patterns. Different relationships activate different behaviors. Different memories reorganize self-perception differently. Even physical states alter personality expression subtly throughout the day. The mind then stitches these fluctuating experiences together into a coherent narrative called me. Because this reconstruction happens continuously and automatically, the finished identity feels stable, even while the processes generating it remain highly adaptive and constantly changing beneath awareness. Memory plays a central role in maintaining this illusion, because continuity depends heavily on remembered narrative structure. The brain connects present awareness to remembered versions of the self and interprets both as belonging to the same identity across time. But memory itself is reconstructive, emotional, and constantly updated. This means the continuity of self partly depends on continuously rewritten memories, maintaining enough narrative consistency to preserve identity coherence psychologically. You do not remember yourself objectively across time. You reconstruct prior versions of yourself through the perspective of the present mind interpreting them now. Over time, the self becomes less like a stable entity moving through life, and more like an evolving narrative system continuously reorganizing its own history to maintain coherence. This is why people often feel emotionally distant from former versions of themselves, despite still calling them me. The continuity exists conceptually, but emotionally the identity may feel partially unfamiliar because the nervous system reconstructing the memory now differs significantly from the one that originally experienced it. The self feels continuous, because the brain preserves narrative linkage, not because identity remains psychologically identical across time. Emotion changes identity constantly because emotional states reorganize perception, behavior, thought patterns, and self-concept automatically. A confident emotional state produces a different version of the self than anxiety does. Shame alters identity expression differently than excitement. Loneliness changes attention differently than belonging. The nervous system continuously shifts psychological orientation according to emotional context, and each state subtly changes what feels true, important, threatening, or possible. Yet people usually experience these shifts as temporary moods happening to one stable self, rather than recognizing how deeply emotional states alter identity construction itself. In reality, different emotional conditions activate different configurations of personality, memory accessibility, attentional focus, and behavioral readiness beneath awareness. The resulting self may feel emotionally distinct across situations while consciousness still interprets all versions as one continuous person. What feels like a stable identity is often the nervous system rapidly transitioning between adaptive self-states linked together through narrative continuity afterward. Context changes personality more than most people realize because human behavior adapts relationally and environmentally automatically. The version of yourself present with family differs from the version present with strangers. The self expressed during stress differs from the self expressed during safety. Different social environments activate different emotional expectations, behavioral patterns, language structures, and nervous system responses beneath awareness. Over time, people begin mistaking the currently active self-state for the real self, while ignoring how context-dependent identity expression actually is. But the nervous system continuously reorganizes behavior according to social prediction systems designed to improve adaptation and belonging. The resulting personality shifts feel natural because the transitions happen automatically. Consciousness experiences enough continuity between states to preserve the illusion of a singular stable identity, even while multiple contextual selves operate beneath awareness dynamically throughout everyday life. Attention also shapes identity because what the mind repeatedly focuses on determines which aspects of self become emotionally reinforced over time. A person focused on inadequacy strengthens an identity organized around failure. Someone focused on achievement strengthens an identity organized around competence. Attention continuously amplifies certain memories, emotions, goals, insecurities, and narratives while suppressing others. Over time, repeated attentional patterns create stable self-perceptions that feel objectively true. But these self-concepts are partly constructed through selective reinforcement operating beneath awareness. Different attentional habits would gradually produce different versions of the self emotionally and behaviorally. The person then experiences the resulting identity as essential personality, rather than recognizing how strongly attentional repetition shaped what now feels psychologically stable and familiar. The body continuously reshapes identity because physiological states influence perception, emotional interpretation, motivation, energy, memory accessibility, and behavioral readiness automatically. Exhaustion changes personality expression. Chronic stress changes personality expression. Hormonal shifts alter emotional orientation. Illness changes thought patterns. Nervous system regulation changes confidence, patience, emotional openness, and attentional stability. Yet people rarely recognize how deeply physical conditions alter the self they experience moment to moment. The mind usually interprets these shifts as temporary distortions happening to one stable identity. But psychologically, the body is actively participating in identity construction continuously. A person in survival-oriented physiological states may experience the world as fundamentally threatening. A regulated nervous system may experience the same world as manageable and emotionally open. The resulting differences affect not only mood, but the structure of identity itself. Different bodily conditions produce different perceptual realities, emotional responses, and behavioral possibilities beneath awareness. The self, therefore, changes physiologically as much as psychologically, even while consciousness maintains the feeling of uninterrupted continuity across those changing internal states. Relationships reshape identity constantly because human consciousness develops relationally rather than in isolation. Around different people, different emotional systems activate automatically. Some relationships reinforce confidence. Others reinforce insecurity. Some expand emotional openness. Others increase defensiveness or hypervigilance. Over time, repeated relational environments stabilize different versions of the self until those versions begin feeling emotionally natural within specific contexts. A person may genuinely feel like a different individual depending on who they are interacting with, because the nervous system reorganizes behavior predictively according to relational expectations beneath awareness. The mind then interprets all these varying self-states as belonging to one singular stable person because narrative continuity links them conceptually afterward. But relational environments are continuously reshaping which aspects of identity become emotionally accessible, reinforced or suppressed in real time. The self adapts relationally much more fluidly than most people consciously realize. Language stabilizes identity artificially, because words create conceptual continuity around experiences that are constantly changing underneath. Labels such as introvert, anxious, confident, creative, or successful simplify highly dynamic psychological processes into stable categories the mind can predict efficiently. Once these labels become integrated into self-concept, future experiences begin getting interpreted through them automatically. The person then experiences continuity, not because the underlying psychological reality remains unchanged, but because language keeps organizing changing experiences into familiar conceptual frameworks. The label becomes psychologically sticky. Contradictory experiences receive less attention, while confirming experiences strengthen the identity structure further. Over time, the self begins feeling stable partly because language continuously compresses fluid psychological processes into simplified narrative categories consciousness can easily recognize and repeat. The nervous system strongly prefers continuity because stable identity improves prediction and reduces uncertainty. If the self felt radically unstable from moment to moment, behavior would become emotionally disorganizing. The brain therefore works continuously to preserve enough coherence that experience feels unified across changing internal conditions. Memory links present awareness to past narratives. Emotion creates familiar patterns. Habits stabilize behavior. Social reinforcement maintains recognizable roles. All these systems cooperate to create the sensation of one continuous self moving steadily through time, but the stability is functional rather than absolute. The nervous system prioritizes coherence because coherent identity improves adaptation. The resulting self feels stable because the brain successfully minimizes awareness of how dynamic and context-dependent identity construction actually is beneath the surface. This becomes especially visible during major life transitions because identity continuity temporarily weakens when familiar structures disappear. Breakups, grief, relocation, trauma, career shifts, illness, aging, or major emotional experiences can destabilize the narrative systems maintaining continuity. The person may suddenly feel unfamiliar to themselves because the emotional environments reinforcing prior identity structures no longer exist in the same way. Thoughts change. Priorities shift. Emotional reactions reorganize. Familiar desires disappear. The mind then experiences this disruption as existential instability because the continuity system temporarily struggles to integrate the new psychological configuration coherently. Yet these moments reveal how adaptive identity actually is. The self was never fixed beneath experience. It was continuously reconstructed through interaction with changing emotional, relational, bodily, and environmental conditions all along. People often feel disturbed by old versions of themselves because current identity structures reinterpret past behavior through present emotional frameworks automatically. A person may look back at previous beliefs, relationships, insecurities, ambitions, or emotional reactions and feel psychologically disconnected from the individual who once embodied them. The continuity exists intellectually, but emotionally the older self can feel partially foreign. This happens because the nervous system reconstructing the memory now operates through different emotional priorities, identity structures, and predictive systems than the one active at the time of the original experience. The mind still labels both versions me to preserve continuity, but beneath that narrative linkage the psychological configuration may have changed dramatically. What feels unsettling is realizing how much identity can transform while consciousness still experiences itself as one uninterrupted self across time. Social roles also contribute heavily to the illusion of stable identity because repeated external reinforcement teaches people to maintain recognizable versions of themselves predictively. Families, friendships, workplaces, cultures, and institutions reward consistency because consistency improves social predictability. Over time, people internalize these reinforced roles deeply enough that they begin feeling like essential personality rather than adaptive social structures. The nervous system then recreates familiar versions of the self automatically within expected environments, because predictability reduces uncertainty socially and emotionally. Yet, different environments can rapidly activate entirely different self-states beneath awareness. The person remains recognizable enough to preserve continuity, but identity expression shifts constantly according to relational context, expectation, and emotional relevance. The stable self, therefore, exists partly because social systems continuously reinforce coherence externally as well as internally. This is why moments of extreme emotion can temporarily make people feel like completely different individuals. Intense fear, grief, love, shame, rage, excitement, or despair radically reorganize perception, memory access, behavioral readiness, bodily regulation, and emotional interpretation within seconds. During these states, priorities change. Moral reasoning may shift. Attention narrows differently. The world itself feels altered. Later, once the nervous system stabilizes again, people often struggle to understand why they behaved or felt so differently. They interpret the experience as not being themselves, even though that emotional configuration was also part of the broader adaptive identity system operating beneath awareness. The mind preserves continuity afterward by treating the intense state as temporary deviation from a more stable core self. But psychologically, identity is always fluctuating according to interacting emotional, physiological, social, and predictive systems, continuously reorganizing experience beneath awareness. The illusion of a completely stable self becomes strongest because consciousness experiences continuity narratively rather than mechanically. The mind tells a continuous story, linking changing experiences together into one recognizable identity moving through time. This narrative smooths over contradictions, emotional shifts, contextual selves, memory reconstruction, changing desires, and fluctuating priorities in order to preserve psychological coherence. The resulting self feels singular because the story feels singular. But beneath the narrative, the actual systems generating thought, emotion, attention, behavior, and identity remain highly adaptive and continuously changing. Consciousness experiences the integrated story rather than the fragmented processes producing it underneath. The stable you therefore feels psychologically real, not because identity remains fixed, but because narrative continuity successfully organizes change into an emotionally coherent experience of selfhood across time. The deeper realization is not that the self is fake or meaningless. It is that identity is alive. The person you call you is not a static object permanently preserved beneath experience. It is an adaptive psychological process, continuously rebuilt through memory, emotion, attention, bodily state, relationships, social reinforcement, prediction, and narrative coherence, interacting moment by moment beneath awareness. Every day the nervous system updates priorities, interpretations, emotional patterns, and behavioral tendencies according to changing internal and external conditions. Consciousness then experiences enough continuity between these shifting states to preserve the feeling of one stable self moving through time. Once this becomes visible, identity changes fundamentally. The self stops feeling like something fixed you permanently possess and begins feeling like something continuously constructed in real time. And within that realization, personal change becomes easier to understand. You are not failing to remain the same person forever. The mind was never designed to preserve absolute sameness. It was designed to continuously adapt while creating just enough continuity for the changing process to still feel like you.